Okay, let's talk a little posthumanism. I'm here with Adam Nocek, who works on philosopher Gilles Deleuze and also Alfred North Whitehead on issues of molecular animation in science and technology studies and applying philosophy to these technologies. But today we're here to talk about interiority, subjectivity, and technology. Right?
Excellent.
So, give me your riff on how does technology change our sense of who we are?
I think technology changes good and complicated question because I think um, that one of the things that we need to get over in our sort of postmodern epoch is this idea that we have a self that is fundamental technology. In other words, that we start with a self and then that there's technology that somehow alters it. I mean, I think we've moved into an age in which there's something like um, a coevolution of self and technology, or maybe even that's to separate it out. We need to start thinking about how it is that what it is we come to call um, an identifiable self emerges through technological
Right, right.
advancement.
So if you go back to the Descartes and maybe the viewers here have read the Descartes, so there he's trying to get to this fundamental sense of a self.
Right.
Like I can sort of in essence.
Right, exactly.
And so what you're saying is like, what if there's no essence? It's not that technology changes the self. What if there was no self that was sort of there ahead of time?
Right,
There was
exactly.
no Plato there
Exactly.
to be
Exactly.
molded by the technology. But instead, to use a more organic metaphor, they're symbiotic and they sort of grow together.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things to think about is how um, Descartes' cogito ergo sum is itself a product of a particular kind of philosophical modernity that employed a range of technologies. And you have to have a very broad understanding of what technology is in this context. Technologies were political technologies, scientific technologies, religious technologies that shaped what it is that Descartes actually was required to say within this sort of philosophical
Right.
modernity.
He has to account for God. He has to account
Precisely.
for a whole other world view because he's thrown in a particular place in a particular time.
Right.
So one of the other ways to think about this is if we often do these sort of thought experiments. Well, what if I lived in a different time, or what if I lived in a different place? Right? How would that change who I am?
Exactly.
So fundamentally, this who I am, this essence, doesn't exist. It grows with that place and time. So
Exactly.
you would never know if I lived in the 16th century. I would never know the self I would be today, or vice versa.
Exactly. I mean, you might ask, is Descartes possible today?
Well,
Right? I mean,
yeah, no, it's not possible.
is there a Descartes that's possible today? Right? And I really don't think that. Actually,
There are Cartesians.
There are Cartesians. I mean, and then there are sort of holdovers from Descartes, right? You might look at sort of the transhumanist movement, right? Where you have philosophers like Nick Bostrom, who were arguing essentially that the human is this shell that we can um, sort of
a consciousness we can upload.
right, right. Well,
stuff,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Well, the
Yeah,
human body is essentially a shell that we could scrap, for example, right? And then we could move beyond into some sort of cybernetic hyper-awareness or something like that. One might argue that that is a holdover from Cartesianism, but sort of downloaded into our contemporary epoch.
Yeah, this is great. So many of the viewers here have read Merleau-Ponty, so they're aware of this sort of contrast between the Cartesian and the
Right. So
phenomenology.
one of the things that'd be interesting to think about is the way in which sort of embodiment, right, and through Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology and so forth, embodiment becomes something that we have to deal with now, at least since the 20th century.
This is one of the things I think I've posed to students in the past is if you had a different body, might you actually end up thinking differently? So then you can add to that, if you had different technology, how would you think differently?
No, it's a really interesting question, right? And then especially, I mean, to think about, well, I mean, maybe you can even make that a more of a complex question and to think about the body as a particular kind of technology, right? and to think about how it is that abstracting from that body is the privilege of only particular kinds of technologies of the body.
Great. Okay, now let's move. So we have the industrial era, 19th century up to early 20th century. You have films like Metropolis and have particular types of technologies and human bodies in relationship to that. Now we're in 21st century, and in the U.S., few people are making things in that same way,
Right.
and was recognizable as sort of industrial labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we make things at different, we make ideas, we make services,
Right.
a whole bunch of other things. So you might think, how does that relationship between labor, capital, and technology affect a sense of self?
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess, one of the things that's fundamentally different is that there's no a kind of privileged sense of subjectivity or interiority that is outside of the production of a self by capital is in some ways no longer possible. In other words, we kind of live in an era, and I'm thinking of reading, thinking of Frederick Jameson here, and I don't know if your students have read Fred Jameson, but one of the things that changes in the postmodern epoch is that we no longer have this sort of relationship to a self that is outside of capitalist exploitation. In other words, thoughts, ideas, information, and all of these sorts of things that we thought that were intimately our own, right? And even sort of felt bodily experiences. They're no longer things that can't be commodified.
Right.
They're fundamentally commodified. So one way to think about this is that is that the relationship between interiority and exteriority of the body has fundamentally eroded, and capital has paved the way for that kind of for the differences between interiority and exteriority to become no longer as essential.
Senses of self can be bought and
exactly
changed, etc., by what I wear and sort of my Facebook identity and so forth.
No, absolutely. Or you think about, I'm amazed at how my students are they're better self-marketers than I am, right? They brand themselves. They haven't really, that's not to say that my students haven't done anything, but really in terms of, producing things like human capital, they haven't actually done that much, right? But at the same time, they're much better marketers than I ever will be or am or will be. But in a sense that's necessary for the production of their subjectivity, right? Is that they're, just because they're not being paid for the way that they brand themselves doesn't mean, in other words, and just because it's not wage labor doesn't mean that they're not laboring. It doesn't mean that they're not producing value in some particular way.
So one of the questions, and this is for the audience out there, is to think about, is there an outside? This is the lingering question within philosophy. Is there an outside? Is there a way out? Or is that all there is?
Right.
Thanks.